This demonstration involves the third sketch for the texture sketchbook unit. So we're calling this texture replication. If you remember, I asked you to find at least 3 good magazine textures. The reason for that is so that when you photocopy them, and you will have to photocopy them, you can compare the value register to kind of what your imagery looks like. A lot of times there's discrepancies between the original and how it photocopies. In this case, I've found one that's going to work pretty well. I've got a lot of different values. The textures are pretty easy to see. A lot of repetition stuff going on in there. So I will go with this one. It's best to photocopy all of those textures and then decide on which one you think photocopies the best. So you will not use your original texture. You're going to pull photocopies of them and then choose which one you're going to use, right? So I made my original texture something that would fit within this kind of boxy area. If you remember when I outlined this in class, I said, take about half of the space, or maybe a little less than half of this space, such that you can have your texture here. We can have the replication element down here. Kind of gave myself a little bit of a challenge here because I tore these edges instead of keeping them super straight, but that's going to actually help me for a variety of reasons. So I'm going to use my X-Acto knife and try to get that at least close to what my original shape was. And I don't want to include any white space if at all possible. So I'm going to cut in just a little bit on this one so I don't have any extra white space. Of course, always cut on a cutting mat. So once you've got your texture cut out, you're going to decide upon the orientation in terms of how you're going to glue this down, how you're going to draw that, right? So in this case, I don't know, I think I'll go like so. I'll probably end up gluing it like that. So what you want to do is take your texture, move it down here, and you want to trace kind of lightly around the edges of this, which, as you know, in this class we don't do this very often or ever. There are few instances in which we would start with a contour on the outside and then work to develop texture or imagery on the inside of that contour, because we know we almost always get that contour incorrect. But in this case, we're tracing that contour, so we know we'll have that correct, right? In this case, what I would do is take another piece of paper. I would, and unfortunately I'm in my home studio, so I don't have any stick glue here, but I think I do have some Elmer's glue that I'll use later. But you'll just take a piece of like paper, flip it over, put stick glue, like go from the middle to the edges, make sure there's plenty of it. And then you want to glue that in the orientation that you have created your texture contour down here. Okay, so this is going to be a combination of using graphite and ink in specific locations, kind of depending on the value of the texture that we see. First thing that I'm going to do is start to evaluate like major contrast or subject element differences in here. So I'm going to kind of look at my patterns and my textures, think about shapes that I can use there, think about how I would divide that up. So in this case, I've got these sort of medium value shapes that are breaking up these like smaller areas that have darker and sometimes more contrasting values. And so I'll kind of map that out. So kind of thinking about, with regard to my contour here, like roughly where I feel like that's at. I would start loose on this Again, I'm just using like a mechanical pencil for now, but I will get into a lot more technical stuff later. So I've kind of got this area mapped out to a degree. Now I'm going to kind of look at the next layer. To me, this looks like it kind of comes down to about this point, maybe a little bit more even. And since this is even the same, proportion, you could measure these and decide how large you need to make those. So let's see. I'm going to just outline some things up here just to kind of help me out, like this brick texture. I'm going to kind of follow the grout in there to the degree that I see it. And again, you just want to work lightly to start. Because I've got some real geometric stuff going on here, it may benefit me to use a ruler. So feel free to do that if you need. Thinking about the type of line that I would need to use to replicate this. So I'm kind of looking at this grass, starting with a little bit of scribble gesture in here to get started. These bushes, scribble gesture seems to be the right technique and texture to work with. So when you think about the line work that you're going to be using, think about the texture you're using, or rather intimating. So of course, values, textures together. I need to make this quite a bit darker. Seems like I maybe need to make that a little bit bigger here. And I can push this next subject over here. There we go. So my goal is to make this look as close to this as possible. I'm definitely going to have to make use of a ruler in this area here. So what I might do is kind of like map out where I feel the beginnings of these would start. So I'm thinking about this being, oh, this would kind of start here. It's going to kind of move over that way. So right now I'm not going to use a ruler, but I'll come back and crisp these lines up. I'm just going to kind of map out. Kind of come back up here, apply a little bit more shading to this to kind of, looks a little empty up there. And you want to actually try to match the values that you see up in here. So it may be beneficial for you not to glue this down for a bit, right? Like if I'm trying to match this value, you know, I might drop that next to it and see how much darker I need to go. And that's where I'll probably be applying some ink over the top of my graphite just to deepen it a little bit more. I know it's going to need that. And there should be a lot more value all over in this area, so I'm just going to kind of work that back and forth until I can get a regular linear value happening there. Break up that hatching a little bit here. And back to these squares. Definitely not my favorite part of the composition. I don't know why I chose this one then. I really like to work more with organic types of textures, but I guess I must have thought, oh, good challenge, right? Okay. Okay, now I'm ready to jump into, I think I need to move this line up a little bit more to accommodate for my windows or whatever those are. I'm going to try to look at the dominant perspective elements that are happening in here, so it kind of looks like everything's at a slant like this. So what I might do, let's see, Might just kind of create some perspectival lines that I can use to help me with these windows. Which again, if you have a really geometric situation like this, use a ruler, it'll be easier. But I'm just gonna go this way for now, come back up, clean things up a little bit later. So this way I can kind of think about where I would place these windows, like this one. Basically what I'm doing is I'm making sure that the contours of these windows kind of align with this direction. These windows are spaced apart quite a bit more. Using your eraser for subtraction is a great technique for this. So think about that. A lot of times dropping kind of drawing in a very flat value and then taking highlights out of that can be helpful for those weird little highlights that you have a hard time mapping. Definitely need to make these all a little bit more square. This is not going to be perfect to the image, right? But the idea is that that one's actually quite a bit lighter. The idea is that you are spending time really observing, evaluating, and looking at shape structures within a tight pattern and practicing that. Just like when, I talk about this a lot in class, when we draw the portrait, we're never going to be able to get the hair to look absolutely correct, but we need to make it believable, right? So it's kind of what you want to think about with this sketchbook task. How can you make that texture believable in terms of the one that you are trying to replicate? Again, if there's discrepancies, that's okay, as long as it's mostly believable, right? Okay, so it took me quite a bit of time. I feel like to bring this all the way out. And again, my goal is to make this as close to this as possible using using graphite. It doesn't have to be the mechanical pencil, right? You can use any of the pencils that are in your kit. Don't use charcoal. No charcoal. Then that's going to be a mess. And then areas that you think you need to push deeper, like, this spot within this, I don't know, it looks like a grassy area. Maybe it needs to be a little bit bigger, actually, even more. Like, I'll get that up to a certain point, but I know I need to push it darker, like in here. So I'm going to go in there with a ballpoint pen or your micron pen, anything that you can use to deepen it, and really push that darkness and that depth. Like, for instance, in this window, right? Let's see. That kind of coordinates with this one here. While it would look really good to use value there with my graphite, it would look even better to work that in with ballpoint pen or micron to really push that value darker. Because it looks like it would be a 9 probably, or maybe 8. This area over here being a lot darker, so I'm just going to kind of demonstrate how you'd work with your graphite and then push it a little bit further with ink. And again, we're thinking about line work. We're not smudging, right? We will do similar tactics with charcoal when we start dealing with texture. The thing I like about starting first with graphite and mapping stuff and getting kind of your general stuff in there is that you can make modifications as you need to, right? So having this in graphite made it to where if I see this lighter than the way I had, I can pull that value back out, go in there, apply a light value with graphite, which is a lot easier to attain. I'm sure you figured out than trying to use pen and ink to get those light values. So kind of think about the lighter value range is like, you know, your 5s down to your 1s, right? And then thinking about how you would use kind of like maybe a combination of your pen, your pencil together to maybe look at those areas that are 8s, that are 9s, that are absolute 10s to really try to get that nice and clean. So again, I'm not going to demonstrate the entire thing. It would take quite a bit of time. I will continue working on mine. So just to remind you of what you're doing, 3 textures, right? You're going to photocopy them, decide on which texture is the absolute best texture, cut that out as you wish, trace around it, yeah? What you're going to do is glue that up in here, and you're going to replicate, which is why we call it texture replication, right? For this assignment, you're going to replicate it as closely as you can to the original, right? There will be discrepancies. I'm not going to drop points on you if there's a few discrepancies. It more or less needs to generally look like the texture. Again, you're not going to be able to get perfect. So I look forward to seeing what y'all come up with next week.